Hey, Time Machine travelers! I'm Miss Ziegler, the Time Machine teacher, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about your summer assignment. When I introduced it, it was quite rushed, so I want to make sure that you completely understand what you're supposed to be doing. Now, when I was introducing it, I told you that the curriculum is changing this year. And that's why it's super important that you understand the stuff that is in the summer assignment, because the summer assignment is all about setting the foundation of world history. So the old curriculum, we used to start at the very beginning of time and go all the way until like the 1990s-ish. But now we're going to be starting around 1200. The first couple weeks of school, we're going to be setting that foundation of what you're going to be doing in your summer assignment, and also just the basic foundation of world history as a whole. But it's important that you do the summer assignment so that you'll have some knowledge about it coming in, because if you don't, we're not going to have a lot of time to spend on it. We're only going to be spending a couple of weeks versus several months that we've done in the past. All right, so just keep that in mind, that if there's anything in here that you don't understand, make sure that you're asking about it that first couple weeks of school, because history is kind of like a domino effect, and one thing leads to another, and that's why it's so important to have these building blocks as a foundation for what we're going to be going into when we start the 1200s. Okay, so let's get started. At the very beginning of civilization, we had the Paleolithic age, all right? That's where you will see cavemen and the beginnings of fire. And when fire is introduced, or when fire is discovered, that's when people can start eating meat and introduce more protein into their diet. So that's why that's important. Then we have the Neolithic Revolution, where we go from hunting and gathering, which is basically hunting and gathering things in the woods that they can eat. And now in the Neolithic Revolution, they start to farm and they settle down. They're a little bit more sedentary, which means that they don't move around the way that they did when they were hunting and gathering. So when you're hunting and gathering, you have to follow the herds and follow the animals and make sure that you are keeping up with them as they're moving around, right? But when you're farming, you have to stay with your crops. And so after the Neolithic Revolution happens, that's when we see people start to settle down and have more civilization type environments, okay? So that brings us to the 4 river valleys. The very first one that I'm going to talk about in this video is the Egyptian River Valley. All right, you need to find ESPN of each one of these river valleys, and then you need to compare them. So we're going to go over Egyptian first. You can take some notes and then use it as the start of your comparison. If you'd also like to do some online research, that's great as well. I'm just going to be giving you the very basics. Okay, here we go. Several of you probably know a lot about Egypt. It's one of the most intriguing of the river valleys because of their beliefs religiously, and Egypt is really studied a lot by Egyptologists. However, there are some specifics that are also really important. Economically, they relied heavily on trade because they needed timber and stones for their many building projects, such as the pyramids that they were building, as well as they really liked luxury items like gold and spices. And so trade was really important. Trade will also bring them into contact with other civilizations around them. Socially, they do have a social hierarchy, and there are several pyramids online that will break it down even more than what I'm going to break it down for you today. But the basics is that the pharaoh is on top. The pharaoh would be the king or the queen, and then under them would be the merchants, artisans, doctors, lawyers. Under them would be the peasants, and at the very bottom were the slaves. The slaves are usually going to be prisoners of war that were taken when Egypt goes to conquer other areas of land. And the slaves and the peasants would usually work side by side on building projects, irrigation projects, as well as in the fields. Also, they had a writing system, and they wrote using hieroglyphics, basically a system of pictures that represent words. They were really good with astronomy, and out of this, they made a very reliable calendar. They're also polytheistic religiously. So that brings us to what is polytheistic. Polytheistic means that they are worshiping many gods, so not just one. And they have several gods within their religion, all with different names. And it's kind of interesting if you'd like to look that up and research that a little bit more, the different types of gods that they have. They also have what's called the Book of the Dead, which basically outlines what the afterlife is going to be about. The Egyptians believed that they could take their actual bodies as well as any belongings that they wanted to into the afterlife. That's why pyramids were so important for pharaohs, because their tombs were full with everything that they wanted to take into the afterlife with them. Could include pets. And you can see, if you go to the Fine Arts Museum, they have a mummy of a cat, I believe it is, in their one of their exhibits that came from Egypt. And so even animals would go with them into the afterlife, including people. Sometimes they would even take family members or servants with them when they died. So mummies are really important because what they did when they did the mummification process is they would basically be preserving the body for the afterlife. If you get a chance this summer, definitely go to the Natural Science Museum. They have an amazing Egyptian exhibit that really shows you a lot of the culture, and they even have some mummies there that you can see on display. So definitely check that out if you get a chance this summer. I think Thursdays are free, so you might want to check into that as well. That would be a little bit more economical time to go. So politically, Egypt is broken up into three main kingdoms: the Old, the Middle, and the New. And during these kingdoms, pharaohs would rule, and there are different pharaohs during different times, dynasties, sometimes like families would rule, and that's basically how their politics worked. During the New Kingdom, we have a queen, Queen Hatshepsut, and she is responsible for expanding trade within Egypt. She also is responsible for enabling women to have rights. This is one of the differences in Egypt because the Egyptian civilization gives women the most rights out of all the River Valley civilizations. Women's rights in Egypt included being able to buy, sell, and inherit property, as well as getting a divorce. So even though they were still subservient to men, they had more rights in Egypt. So that part would go with social as far as women's rights go. But it's mostly in the New Kingdom that happens. Back to political, we know that Egypt is ruled by pharaohs who are basically like kings. Some dynasties treated themselves as though they were gods, and the people were made to believe that the pharaoh was a god. And they were also in charge of doing irrigation and drainage when the Nile flooded. One thing they used for irrigation is called a shadoof. And this was a piece of technology that they made in order to be able to irrigate their fields. Then we're on to environment. So environment is that they built their River Valley civilization around a river. It's in the name, right? Now, don't use that as one of your similarities because that's way too obvious. That's like saying, well, they all had green grass or they all had sheep. No, okay? Dig a little deeper with your similarities and differences, as I was telling you when I introduced the project. However, it is important to remember that the Nile River goes with Egypt, and they built the Egyptian civilization around the Nile River. The reason they did that is because when the floods came in, it actually helped to make the ground more fertile. The other good thing about the Nile River is that it was predictable flooding, so they knew when it was going to happen, and this is going to lead to more fertile ground, which will lead to more surplus of food. Surplus of food is important because if you have enough food to go around, that frees up people from working the land to being able to go and do other things, like creating and writing and making new inventions and technology. All right, so that's why surplus of food is so important. And in Egypt, it was very predictable because of the predictable flooding. One thing I forgot to share with you when we were talking about polytheistic religion is the reason why people came up with religion in the first place. They needed something to explain the things that were happening. For example, when a devastating flood comes and it ruins all the crops, why is that happening? Well, the gods must be angry. And on the good times, when they had a surplus of food, and they'd celebrate that because now the gods are happy with them. And so that's kind of how this idea of religion started, because people needed something to explain what was happening in their life, or to maybe even give them hope for the future or hope for better times. Also, to just explain what is naturally going on around them. You know, why does it thunderstorm? Why is there lightning? Things like that. Eventually, the Roman Empire is going to absorb Egypt. We'll talk about that when we talk about Rome and Greece. But for now, that's the basics of what you need to know about the Egyptian River Valley. Like I said, if you'd like to look up more, feel free. There are several pharaohs that are very interesting, including my favorite, Cleopatra. She deserves her own video, which I might have to make this year. And King Tut is also really interesting because several of his artifacts have come to light and are on display in different museums throughout the world. So definitely look into Egyptian River Valley a little bit deeper if you would like. But there is your ESPN for the Egyptian River Valley. Next we have the Mesopotamian River Valley. The Mesopotamian River Valley is not united all under one king. In fact, they have several city-states, which are kind of like smaller civilizations within one large one. Let's start with the environment of Mesopotamia. So we're starting with the end first. Environment is that they are also beside rivers. Actually, they're in between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in an area of the world that is called the Fertile Crescent. One thing about their environment is that the flooding was not predictable. This really hurt the people in a lot of ways because they didn't know when it was coming the way that the Egyptians knew. Sometimes flooding would cause large devastation, which brings them to thinking that the gods are angry at them. They also started to build further away from the river in order to not have it be so devastating when it actually did flood. And the last thing about their geography is that they're not very protected by geography, and so they were always invaded. This will eventually lead to their downfall in around 1700 BCE. All right, so let's go back to the beginning to economics. Economics, once again, based on trade. That's pretty much how everything works at this time. They have a surplus of food, and so they need to trade for other items that they may not have. Cuneiform also helps them to do this. Cuneiform is their form of writing that they invent, and it spreads through trading to other civilizations around because they're using it to keep track of merchant accounts. Socially, we have the king on top, then the priests and priestesses, then we have the scribes, followed by the merchants and artisans, and lowest would be commoners, and under them would be slaves. So very similar to other structures in river valleys. Religiously, they are polytheistic. It is unique though in that each city-state has one specific god that only they worship, and then there are a collection of gods that all the city-states worship. They also build what are called ziggurats, which are kind of like terraced pyramids, and these are temples to their gods. Women did have some rights. They were allowed to become priestesses in some cases, and they were also allowed to run businesses and own property. However, they were still subservient to men, and most women would have been just in the household, performing duties strictly for women. Women's rights in Mesopotamia depended on which city-state you were in. For example, in Samaria, women were allowed to own property and run businesses. However, they were not allowed to do that in Babylon. So it just kind of depended where you were located. For the most part, women were very subservient to men, and most of their life spent doing household duties such as raising the children and cooking and cleaning. They were also, in some cases, allowed to become priestesses, which was a very high honor. Politically, as I've said, is that they were divided up into large city-states. So each one of these city-states would have had their own king and government. Sumer is one of those city-states, and they are responsible for really perfecting agriculture as well as inventing cuneiform. And cuneiform is going to become very important because writing is so needed. Cuneiform will be used for writing laws, will be used in court, as well as for the merchants and keeping track of trade. They also perfect math, and they use geometry, and they're responsible for a 12-month calendar. Babylon, another city-state in Mesopotamia, is eventually taken over by King Hammurabi. King Hammurabi comes up with the Code of Hammurabi, which is basically one of the earliest law codes in all of history. What is important about it is that it identifies how to bring justice to minor offenses as well as more extreme offenses. for all classes of people, which had never been done before. So one of the very important parts of the Code of Hammurabi is an eye for an eye, which is basically, if you do this to me, I'm going to do it back to you, and most of the time it's going to be worse. If anyone steal the property of a temple or of the court, he shall be put to death, and also the one who receives the stolen thing from him shall be put to death as well. So you can see sometimes the punishment is much harsher than the crime. Let's see. If anyone steal the minor son of another, he shall be put to death. If anyone find runaway male or female slaves in open country and bring them to their master, the master of the slave shall pay him 2 shekels of silver. If anyone is committing a robbery and is caught, he shall be put to death. Lots of death in this law code. Most of these have to do with farming, of course, because farming and agriculture definitely are in their lives, right? It's a big part of their lives. So, for example, this one says, if anyone be too lazy to keep his dam in proper condition and does not so keep it, if then the dam break and all the fields be flooded, then shall he in whose dam the break occurred be sold for money, and the money shall replace the corn which he has caused to be ruined. So you better not be lazy. Better keep that dam good and intact. This was a way of keeping people in line and bringing justice to that area. So as I was saying before, the environment just didn't really protect them very much, and so Mesopotamia was constantly invaded. Babylon is eventually going to be overrun by the Hittites, and then eventually the Assyrians will come in and take over. That's when King Nebuchadnezzar takes over Babylon and starts to make it more beautiful and architecturally pleasing. That's where we get the legend of the Hanging Gardens in Babylon, as well as the Bible story of King Nebuchadnezzar and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they wouldn't bow to him and bow to his gods, and he threw them in the fiery furnace. And there were suddenly 4 in the fiery furnace instead of 3. So that's a Sunday school lesson that you might remember from when you were little if you've attended Sunday school before. And that's just a little bit about the Mesopotamian River Valley. Make sure that if you need any more details to go ahead and check out some more online. Thank you so much for listening. I'll have another video coming about the other 2 river valleys, but for now, make sure you're getting the notes from these. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe to Time Machine Teacher. I really appreciate the support. Thank you so much. Also, socially, okay, I have a little bit more for you. Than in other river valleys.